Welcome back now. The collapse of classrooms in a private school in Kenya last week, which led to the death of 8 pupils and injuries to at least 64 others, has shifted focus to schools in Kenya's informal settlements. The introduction of free primary education in 2002 may have opened the doors wide for Kenyan children to access with great success, but reports show that gains are not equally distributed, with millions still out of school and millions opting for informal schools, leading to inequality in the East African nation's education sector. Our reporter Sarah Kimani went out to see the need in some of these schools.
It is mid-morning in Nairobi's Kawangware informal settlements. We are just in time for a geometry class at the Mwangaza United Primary School.
Tell me also.
Mwangaza, Swahili for light, is different. The rusty corrugated iron sheets have a new coat of paint in anticipation of Education Ministry officials' unannounced visits that started in informal settlements last week. The temporary structures, which easily fit into this low-income area, act as classrooms, with pupils squeezed within the available space. It has been in operation since 1994.
We have only one public school, which is nearby, Katina Primary, which is 3 kilometers away.
This is just one out of the thousands of low-cost private schools in Kenya. Data from a coalition of education rights civil society groups and Kenya's Education Ministry indicate that at least 47% of children living in Kenya's informal settlements attend low-fee paying schools, known as the Alternative Provision of Basic Education and Training Schools, APBET. In Nairobi alone, almost 2 in every 3 children, that is 63%, living in the informal settlements, are enrolled in these schools. The introduction of free primary education in Kenya in 2002 saw an influx of children in public primary schools. The Kenyan government has, however, not been able to keep up in terms of construction of infrastructure, and so congestion has been one of the main problems. Indeed, the schools have mushroomed in the low-income areas out of a need. The Ministry of Education official data shows that private schools increased from 5,534 schools in 2011 to more than 8,900 in 2015. There was, however, very little expansion of public schools.
We should not forget that we have close to 35,000 primary schools.
Let's just be the truth, be told. We are not having enough public primary schools. And that is the gap these schools are filling. Assume, in your language, we demolish all these schools. These huge populations will go where?
Mwangaza currently has a population of 271 children, including a daycare center. Most people in these settlements earn a living from menial jobs. Without enough money to afford babysitters, the school acts as a secure space to leave their young ones. In most of these schools, the fees range between $3 and $5 per month.
They pay monthly or they pay weekly. It is divided into many fractions. Times they pay 200, they pay 100. That is what makes them to have access and acceptance into these institutions.
Questions have, however, arisen about the safety of children within these schools following the collapse of classrooms at the Precious Talent School last week, leading to the death of 8 pupils. The report by the Urban Education Group also pokes holes at the quality of education, indicating that because most of them lack government registration, they do not employ qualified teachers and they sometimes lack proper management structures. The proprietor of Mwangaza disagrees.
When the parents decide to make the decision, they don't look at the facilities, they look at the quality. So there's a reason why they brought their kids here and not in a public school.
When you talk about quality, what are you talking about?
The ability to prepare their kids for future and be an important person in future.
The Education Ministry has since ordered the closure of Precious Talent School and several other such schools deemed to be unsafe for children.
Yes, the books are there.
We visited Ngong Forest Primary School in Nairobi, one of the public primary schools that has been allocated a proportion of the children from the ill-fated school. The impact of the improved access to education is clear: congestion. The head teacher, however, says the numbers are manageable.
The provision of teachers is already done, and we have not had a case whereby there's no learning in this school that there are no teachers.
We don't have to cheat ourselves. A class of 100 learners is a congested class. That should be 3 classes already.
Away from the classrooms, work is underway to document and map the schools' locations in the country, an initiative between the government and civil society. Does the government know that?
They know.
Do they know these schools?
They know. They know. And at one time they were giving these schools FPE, 470 schools. It stopped 3 years ago, but they were funding these schools. They know. That is no doubt about it. They know the schools are there.
The information from this meeting will hopefully inform the Kenyan government's policies on these schools and where it should direct its investments in education. Sarah Kimani for SABC African Perspectives, Nairobi.
So that is what's happening in Kenya. We talk about service delivery generally on the continent, and the responsibility is placed on governments. As South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa is due to meet his Nigerian counterpart Muhammadu Buhari tomorrow for their first bilateral since the attacks in Gauteng and other parts of South Africa, to talk about these issues, what the two leaders are likely to discuss, and how this conversation will assist the leaders and the continent as a whole in improving the plight of migrants. We're joined by Mukoni Ratshitanga, who is a columnist. He's a consultant at Interlinked Advisory Services, and he's also the former spokesperson to former President Thabo Mbeki. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you very much, Tsepis.
So you'd be quite familiar with what happens when two leaders meet, and especially the leaders of South Africa and Nigeria meeting at this particular moment under slightly different circumstances, but it's clear from the communique from both countries that it's not going to be a hostile meeting. What is likely to be top of mind on the agenda here?
Well, look, it depends on what the agenda really is. But I would imagine that the two presidents will talk about, more generally, the relationship between the two countries, which has gone through ups and downs for some times, but which fortunately both countries recognize the importance of that relationship to be at a strong level, cordial, cooperative, in order for both countries, which are very critical countries on the continent, of course, amongst other countries, to be able to do the kinds of things that the continent needs to do to uplift itself, to regenerate itself, but also to build the necessary strength in order to relate with the rest of the world on an equal footing, if you like, but to build that equal footing, the strength that would be able to place us at a sufficient level to exert ourselves.
So, Mr. Ratshitanga, you said it would depend on what would be on the agenda. So in August of 2018, we saw French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and British Prime Minister Theresa May visit various countries on the continent. A lot of it was hinged on FDI, but the issue of migration, how to stem the flow of African migrants, especially traveling to Europe, was also part of the agenda. So this is obviously something that is not unique to South Africa, not unique to Africa. But we've had many conversations around this issue, especially in the past couple of weeks. How should we be framing the discussion now at this point in time?
Sure. I mean, there have been quite a number of conversations about it locally. And I think that the first and most important thing to recognize is what you say, which is that migration is a global phenomenon. And here on the continent, South Africa is just but one of the migration corridors. And as you say, Europe is concerned about African migrants. And the corridor for those African migrants is the Mediterranean. And you know that quite a number of African migrants drown nearly on a daily basis on the Mediterranean, crossing to a Europe that is unwelcoming. And that Europe, and Germany is a particularly interesting case because in 2016 the matter came before the German parliament. And one of the most startling things that was said there, which we don't talk about, and one does not know why we as Africans don't talk about it, was that the Germans were saying, at least some of the parties were saying that, look, we can welcome Syrian immigrants, but not the African ones, because if we do that, in 10 or 15 years' time, we will change the complexion of Germany. Obviously,
yes, I mean,
a racist phenomenon. And there are quite a number of multiple causalities for migration. They've got to do with the politics of countries. They've got to do with economies, not all of those issues, not all of those causal factors are the fault of the Africans. For instance, the West Africans will tell you that part of the cause for economic strife in West Africa is that the Spaniards have been overfishing illegally on the West African coast, as a result of which West African fishermen no longer have the wherewithal to eke out a living. And so people then migrate to Europe via the Mediterranean. And incidentally, one of the big detention centers where horrendous things are visited upon migrants, African migrants, is Spain. So it seems that there's a case to be made that we need to look at the totality of the causal factors in order to deal with this issue comprehensively. It is a common African challenge, and that maybe that's another point that we need to emphasize on in order to inspire a common approach to these issues, because it's not an us and them issue. It's a common African challenge which high walls and electrified fences are not necessarily going to solve.
Now, it is a factor that we can't deny, whether it's internal migration or external, that it does have an impact. It creates some burden on the existing infrastructures of a country, of an area. So that is something that governments have to deal with, and that has to be part of their planning. In such a case, how does a government like the government of South Africa, the government of Nigeria, work in tandem to deal with this?
Well, I wish I could give you a blueprint, but I can't, and I don't think that anybody can. The most important issue is the principles of the issue, in my view. As I was saying, we've got to promote an understanding that says this is a common African challenge, a common African problem. Because once you approach it from that point of view, you will then be able to
The approach
together
is different, yes.
to tackle the challenges that arise out of it. If you understand it as their problem, then there'll be you'll obviously get into a particular frame of mind, and you will pursue whatever informs the logic of that frame of mind, perhaps in ways that are not necessarily helpful. I mean, I've heard it being said here at home recently that African leaders must do 1, 2, 3. African leaders must. And I've wondered whether those who say those kinds of things are excluding South African leaders from this collective of African leaders to whom they are heaping all of these responsibilities. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that I don't think that anybody can give you a blueprint, but you can pursue certain principles.
But you wrote an article recently in which you quoted what former President Olusegun Obasanjo was saying, especially around the issue of migration and how, as a country, they dealt with it. You mentioned the 1983 Executive Ordinance and the Shehu Shagari experience. So perhaps expand a little bit more on that and why it is instructive or it is important for us during this discussion.
What I was saying in that article, drawing from the 1983 Nigerian experience, well, two experiences, two West African experiences. 1969, Ghana expels Nigerian migrants out of Ghana. And then 1983, Nigeria does the same thing. And it leads to all manner of things. First of all, just the immense suffering that governments impose on ordinary people. Secondly, it imposes, it leads to inevitably a very acrimonious relationship between the two governments, which spills over to ordinary citizens. And what I was saying is that perhaps we need to learn from those two experiences in order to have a different way of handling the migration issue. Because here, and my concern was particularly because I have noted, as of course have other people, that there's been over a couple of years now a tendency by prominent South Africans in politics and various other fields to make this issue a mobilizing tool for South Africans against people who are non-South Africans, who are perceived as foreign and are called with various derogatory names. And that is unhelpful. I think that residents of this city would be particularly aware of one prominent citizen of this city who is given to that kind of approach.
Are you talking about the mayor?
Let's leave it there to say that there is a prominent personality in this city who is given to that kind of conduct, which is unhelpful. And what is also notable, Tsepiso, is that South Africans don't have, it's not as if South Africans are naturally inclined to be anti-people from outside the country. Ever since the discovery of gold and diamonds in this country, we've lived together with people from beyond our borders. And in fact, before that, Jan van Riebeeck in 1652 is not a native South African. And of course, that opens up an inflow of people from Europe and all parts of the world. Of course, those ones then organize themselves in a particular way relative to the people that they found here. But if you look at Africans from beyond our borders, they've contributed immensely to, as have European migrants. But look at somebody like Clemens Kadali, for instance. This is the first African trade unionist who forms the first African trade union, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, in 1919. He comes from Malawi. Chief Albert Luthuli is born in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. The former Treasurer General of the ANC, Thomas Nkobi, also hails from Zimbabwe. So we have lived together harmoniously for decades with fellow Africans from beyond our borders, and never really had this negative sentiment towards them. And I think that kind of attitude needs to continue.
So ultimately, it's about creating an atmosphere that enables migrants to not only enrich themselves, to improve their livelihoods and of the communities in which they live, investing in that. But I want to talk about how we can do that structurally as African governments, ensuring that we do deliver services to all residents or all those who live in whatever part of the continent.
Sure, we've got to attend to many issues. We've got to attend to our economies. Our economies have got to be more inclusive. They need to deliver the dividends of freedom and democracy, so that the cake is equitably shared. So you've got to make sure that you attend to that area of policy, but ensure that governments live up to their own promises. You also, I think, have got to be true to something that we always say: regional integration, continental integration. Because there is a case to be made about the economic and social benefits that accrue from that kind of integration. Now, I think we also need to appreciate part of what that entails. Regional and international integration is not only about the trade in goods and services. It is also accompanied by the integration of people. And I think for a society that has been as closed for as long as we have, there are quite a lot of intangible benefits that come from the interaction with people from outside of our borders. And I think that this is part of where we need to emphasize. Take, for instance, the regular conflicts that break between spaza shop owners who are not South Africans and local ones. There is something that we need to learn from how these non-South Africans, South African Africans, conduct business. So that because it's something that is not necessarily innate in the way in which we do business, which is why they beat us at the game. So rather than look at it as a problem, you can also look at it as something positive, But there could be all manner of cross-pollination and cooperation between people.
Unfortunately, it's a pity we have run out of time, but thank you very much for your time and insights, Mr. Mukoni Ratshitanga. He is a columnist. He is also a consultant at Interlinked Advisory Services, also former spokesperson to the President, Thabo Mbeki. Now, South African artist Shawn Madjozi continues to take the world by storm. Her hit song, John Cena, has received amazing reviews in the country and on the continent. This week, popular American TV show host Ellen DeGeneres hosted the WWE superstar, and he took part in the challenge birthed by the song. Social media went wild. Well, that's it from all of us here tonight. Good night.
You gotta get the hips in, yeah, go like that. Take it down like this. And then we just put it up like this. Like this. And then you can just put, oh, I see what you're doing.